The moment the kennel girl knelt, the two monsters who had savaged 3 expert trainers went silent. She was Linnea, a woman paid to shovel waste and fill water bowls, a ghost in the background of a world of alpha trainers and their millionaire clients. He was Alistair Thorne, a man who moved through the modern world like a phantom of industry, his empire as vast and cold as the centuries behind his eyes. The dogs were beasts of nightmare, Caucasian Shepherds bred to the size of small bears, with jaws that could snap bone like twigs, and they were supposed to be his ultimate guardians. But they had answered every command with snarling fury, until this. Until the girl no one ever saw made herself small and quiet on the gravel, and the monsters fell calm. And for the first time in 500 years, the man who commanded armies and markets felt his own frozen heart beat with a terrifying, unfamiliar rhythm. If you believe that true strength is found not in dominance, but in quiet compassion, type stillness below, and let me tell you what happened next. To understand how she got there, you need to know it was meant to be her last day. Linnea was in the process of being erased. The termination paperwork sat on the passenger seat of her aging car. The words, "failure to adhere to protocol, a neat corporate execution." Her boss, Marcus, a man whose charisma was as loud as his aftershave, had blamed her. One of their prize Dobermans had grown anxious and unpredictable, and it was easier to point a finger at the quiet kennel hand than to admit his own harsh, dominance-based methods were fracturing the dog's spirit. So when he'd told her she had to ride out to the Thorne estate for the final demonstration, it wasn't a request. It was a final humiliation. She was to clean the transport cages and be a silent witness to his triumph with the client's new, notoriously difficult acquisitions. A final look at what she was losing. The Thorne estate was less a house and more a shard of the night sky fallen to earth. It rose from the mists of the city's wealthiest escarpment, a structure of black glass, dark steel, and stone that seemed to drink the light. The air grew colder as they passed through the immense iron gates. The temperature dropped several degrees, a strange, localized chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Linnea felt it in her bones, a deep, resonant silence that soaked up sound. The world outside the gates had been a symphony of city life. Inside, there was only the crunch of tires on the black gravel drive and the low, menacing growl that seemed to vibrate up from the very ground. The dogs were waiting in a specially constructed enclosure of reinforced steel and ballistic glass. She'd only seen pictures, Nix and Erebus, brother and sister. Their coats were a storm of gray and black, their heads massive, their eyes small, intelligent, and filled with a primal rage. They were magnificent and terrifying, ancient protectors from the Caucasus Mountains, bred to fight wolves and guard flocks. But in this sterile, modern world, they were just engines of destruction. Marcus strutted toward the enclosure, leash and shock collar in hand, his voice booming with false confidence. He spoke to Mr. Thorne's head of security, a severe man in a gray suit. "He'll see. A firm hand is all they need. Animals crave dominance." Linnea stayed back, her hands tucked into the pockets of her thin jacket. She wasn't watching Marcus. She was watching the dogs. She saw past the bared teeth and the rumbling chests. She saw confusion, fear. Two powerful creatures torn from everything they knew, surrounded by hostile strangers and alien smells, with no flock to guard, no mountain to roam. Only aggression to answer their terror. She could feel their frantic energy like a physical blow, a chaotic storm of instinct and panic. It was a language she had always understood, the silent speech of the animal heart. It was why she was so good at her job, and why no one ever noticed. She didn't command. She listened. The demonstration began. It was a disaster. Marcus entered the enclosure. Erebus, the male, charged instantly. Not a warning snap, but a full-throated 200-pound launch of fury. The head of security had to fire a tranquilizer dart into the dog's flank to stop him from tearing Marcus apart. The trainer stumbled back, his face white, his bravado shattered. They managed to get the male into a holding pen, but Nix was now utterly frantic, a whirlwind of gray fur and snapping teeth. In the chaos, a junior handler fumbled a latch. The gate to the main courtyard swung open. Nix was out. Panic erupted. Men in suits scattered, shouting into radios. Marcus, the great animal expert, froze, his back pressed against a stone wall as the massive dog circled him, her growls echoing like thunder off the glass walls of the mansion. From a high window, a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness of the room behind it. A tall, still figure, watching the chaos unfold below with an unnerving lack of alarm. Alistair Thorne. Linnea didn't think. She moved. She walked calmly into the center of the courtyard, placing herself directly between the terrified trainer and the enraged dog. She didn't shout. She didn't raise her hands. She simply stood there, a small, still point in the swirling storm of fear. "Hey," she said, her voice barely a whisper, carrying on the cold air. "It's okay." She lowered herself to the ground, sinking first to her knees, then sitting back on her heels, making herself smaller, less of a threat. She didn't look the dog in the eye. That was a challenge. Instead, she looked at the ground just to the side of the beast, exposing the vulnerable line of her neck in a gesture of absolute trust, of surrender. The world held its breath. The barking stopped. The low, rumbling growl faltered. Nick stared at this strange, quiet human. This creature wasn't shouting, wasn't threatening, wasn't afraid. It was just there. A calm presence in a world that had been nothing but noise and violence. Linnea spoke again, her voice a soft murmur. "You're just scared. I know. It's all too loud here, isn't it?" Slowly, cautiously, the great beast took a step forward, then another. The massive head, broad as a man's chest, lowered. Hot breath ghosted over Linnea's cheek. She didn't flinch. She just breathed, slow and even, pushing a wave of calm out into the space between them. A scent reached the dog's nose, not the sharp tang of fear sweat that clung to the other humans, but something soft, earthy, like clean soil and rain. Nix nudged Linnea's shoulder with her wet nose, a tentative, questioning touch. Linnea slowly lifted a hand, not to pat her head, but to gently stroke the thick ruff of fur under her chin, a place of comfort. The dog leaned into the touch, a deep sigh shuddering through her powerful body. In the holding pen, Erebus, shaking off the effects of the tranquilizer, had been ramming the gate. Now, seeing his sister's calm, he fell silent, watching the scene with an intelligent, wary gaze. From the high window, Alistair Thorne had not moved, but something inside him, something that had been dormant for centuries, shifted. He had seen generals break, kings beg, empires fall. He had seen every flavor of human courage and cowardice. He had never seen this quiet, unassuming power that met raw fury not with force, but with peace. A door hissed open at the base of the mansion. Alistair Thorne stepped out into the courtyard. The cold intensified. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an ancient authority. Even the frantic security men fell still. The shadows around him seemed to deepen, to cling to his tailored suit like a living cloak. He was tall, impossibly elegant, with a face that looked carved from pale marble. His eyes were the color of a starless midnight sky, and they were fixed on Linnea. He walked across the gravel, his footsteps making no sound. He stopped a few feet away from her and the now docile beast. His voice, when he spoke, was like smoke and old wine, a low baritone that vibrated in the air. "You," he said, addressing Marcus, who was still plastered to the wall. "Leave." Marcus blinked. "Mr. Thorne, I assure you this is just a temporary setback." "You are fired," Alistair stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Your methods are crude and your understanding is non-existent. Get off my property." He gestured, and 2 security guards materialized to escort the sputtering trainer away. Then those dark, bottomless eyes returned to Linnea. She was still on the ground, her hand resting on Nix's broad head. The dog hadn't moved. She was a bulwark of calm at Linnea's side. "What is your name?" he asked. The question was not a pleasantry. It was a demand for information, precise and direct. "Linnea," she managed, her voice small. "Linnea," he repeated, tasting the sound of it. "You are no longer employed by those fools." It was a statement of fact, not an offer. Linnea felt a pang of despair. Of course. She was trespassing. She was part of the failure. She started to get up, ready to be escorted out, just like Marcus. "You are employed by me now," he continued, his voice unwavering. "Your salary is quadrupled. You will have a suite of rooms in the West Wing. Your only duty is to them. He gave a slight nod toward Nix, and by extension, to the watchful Erebus in the pen. "You will start immediately." Linnea stared at him, utterly bewildered. The world had tilted on its axis, fired and hired in the space of 5 minutes, offered a life she couldn't have imagined in her wildest dreams, by a man who radiated a cold so profound it felt like it could freeze time itself. "Why?" she whispered, the question escaping before she could stop it. A flicker of something that might have been surprise, or something far older, passed through his dark eyes. He looked from her to the massive, calm animal at her side. "Because you do not see a weapon," he said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a near intimate confidence. "You see a soul, and that is a skill I cannot purchase elsewhere. It must be given. Now come, I will show you to your rooms." He turned and walked back toward the house, not waiting to see if she would follow. He knew she would. She had nowhere else to go. With a deep breath, Linnea got to her feet. Nix whined softly, pressing against her leg. Linnea gave her a final, reassuring scratch behind the ears before letting the security team, now moving with a newfound reverence, guide the dog back to the enclosure where her brother waited. As Linnea followed the silent, imposing figure of Alistair Thorne into the cavernous, cold heart of his home, she felt the shadows themselves part for him and close in behind her. The heavy glass door hissed shut, sealing her off from her old life, a life where she was invisible. Here, in the home of a man who felt like winter personified, she had been seen, and she was terrified and thrilled in equal measure. The suite he gave her was larger than her entire apartment. It was a space of cool grays, polished chrome, and vast windows that overlooked the brooding forest bordering the estate. It was beautiful, sterile, and profoundly lonely. There were no personal touches, no photographs, no clutter. It was like living inside an architectural magazine. Her life fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. Her days were spent with Nyx and Erebus. She moved them from the cold steel of the enclosure to a large, grassy run she'd insisted they build. She didn't train them in the conventional sense. There were no commands to sit, stay, or heal. Instead, she simply spent time with them. She spoke to them in low, soothing tones. She learned the subtle shift of an ear that meant curiosity, the low rumble that was contentment, not aggression. She taught them her own language of quiet and trust. And they, in turn, accepted her as their pack, their flock, the one still point in their confusing new world. They would follow her anywhere, their massive bodies flanking her, their fierce loyalty a palpable shield. Alistair Thorne was a ghost in his own home. She would go days without seeing him. Then she would turn from filling a water bowl and he would be there, standing silently at the edge of the courtyard, watching her. He never spoke, never approached. He just observed, his stillness more intense than any action. The shadows always seemed deeper where he stood, the air colder. Sometimes, late at night, she would feel a sudden chill in her rooms, a draft from a sealed window. The lights would flicker and dim for a moment, and she would have the unshakable feeling that she was being watched not from a distance, but from very, very close. She wasn't afraid. She should have been. This man was not normal. His house was not normal. The very air around him felt thin, stretched across an abyss of time, but his presence felt protective, like the cold of a mountain that shelters a valley from the wind. The revelation of her true purpose came during a storm. It was a violent, sudden squall that threw black sheets of rain against the glass walls of the mansion. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the foundation. The power grid, for all of Thorne's wealth, was not immune. The lights flickered, died, and then the backup generators kicked in, casting the long corridors in a dim, emergency glow. Linnea was in the main library, a vast, two-story room filled with the scent of old paper and leather. She had been drawn there by the collection, books that were centuries old, their spines uncracked, as if they had been waiting for a reader. Nyx and Erebus were with her. They were never far. But with the storm, their calm vanished. They became agitated, pacing relentlessly, their low growls a constant, threatening hum. They weren't reacting to the thunder. Their attention was fixed on one specific part of the house, the far end of the west wing, a section with no windows, accessible only by a single heavy door of carved oak. They patrolled before it, their hackles raised, their bodies tense as coiled springs. They were guarding. But guarding against what? A voice from the shadows made her jump. They sense it! The disturbance! Alistair Thorne materialized from the darkness at the top of a spiral staircase. He moved with a liquid grace that was utterly silent. He descended into the room, the emergency lights glinting off the severe planes of his face. He was not looking at her, but at the sealed door. "A storm like this," he said, his voice a low murmur, "thins the veil. It excites the old energies. It makes things restless." "What things?" Linnea asked, her hand resting on Nyx's tense shoulder. "What's in that wing?" He finally turned his gaze on her. In the dim, flickering light, his eyes were no longer just dark. For a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, they glowed with a soft, internal light, the color of embers, the color of old blood. "Not what?" he corrected gently. "Who?" He walked toward the door, the dogs parting before him, though they continued to growl at the inanimate object. He stopped before it, his long fingers tracing the ancient carvings. "This house is new," he said. "This door is not. It comes from a place long turned to dust. Behind it is the heart of this estate, the reason for its existence. It is my sanctum, my tomb of a sort. It is where I rest." Linnea's mind struggled to grasp his meaning. Tomb? Rest? "The dogs," he continued, turning back to her, his crimson-tinged gaze holding hers captive. "I did not acquire them to guard against burglars, Linnea. Men of flesh and blood are a trivial concern. I need them to guard against things that do not bleed, things that hunt me." The confession hung in the air, heavy and impossible. He was speaking of monsters, of myths. "There are others like me," he said, answering her unspoken question. "We are territorial. Ancient rivalries do not fade. They sleep. And when one of us is vulnerable, they stir. My rest is a state of profound vulnerability. The dogs are my early warning system. Their instincts are pure, untainted by human skepticism. They can sense a predator that casts no shadow." It all clicked into place. The cold, the silence, the ageless quality in his eyes, the way he knew things about history no scholar could, the way the very world seemed to bend around his presence. He was something ancient, something that slept in a tomb and had enemies as old as time. "But their instincts," he went on, taking a step closer to her, "are a fire without a hearth. They can warn, but they cannot be directed. Their fear can become a weapon turned against them or me. I needed more than a guardian. I needed an anchor, someone whose command they would obey over their own terror, someone they would trust more than their own instincts." He stopped just before her. The cold rolling off him was absolute, the chill of a deep cavern that had never known the sun. "I needed you, Linnea," he whispered. "I have needed someone like you for a very long time." She should have run. She should have screamed. Every rational part of her brain was telling her to flee from this impossible man and his dark, terrifying secrets. But as she looked into his ancient, lonely eyes, she felt no fear, only a profound, aching sadness. He was the ultimate predator, yet he spoke of vulnerability. He was a king in his castle, yet he lived in fear of hunters. He was surrounded by power and wealth, yet he was utterly, completely alone. He was just like the dogs, a powerful, magnificent creature, trapped in a world that didn't understand him, lashing out from a place of fear and solitude. "You are not afraid," he stated. It wasn't a question. It was a marvel. "No," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not." She reached out, a gesture as instinctive as when she had knelt in the courtyard. She laid her hand on his arm. His suit was fine wool, but through it she felt the impossible, shocking cold of his skin. It was like touching a marble statue in the dead of winter. Yet, where her warm palm met him, a jolt, like static electricity, passed between them. The emergency lights overhead flared brightly for a second, then dimmed again. The shadows in the corners of the room writhed. His control, for the barest fraction of a second, had faltered. He looked down at her hand on his arm, his expression unreadable. For centuries, touch had been a prelude to violence, a means of control or a fleeting, empty pleasure. It had never been this. A simple, compassionate connection that felt more real than anything in his long, cold existence. He was a creature of darkness and power, A legend whispered in terrified tones. The world saw a monster, but this small, quiet human with the steady hands and the calm heart, she saw a soul. Would you have stayed, knowing his secret was real and that the danger he guarded against was hunting him? Tell me in the comments, and if you are not subscribed yet, join this family. From that night on, everything changed. The distance between them collapsed. He was no longer a ghostly observer in her life. He became a quiet presence. He began to seek her out. He would find her in the library, and instead of watching from the shadows, he would sit with her in one of the deep leather armchairs. He wouldn't always speak. Sometimes they would just share the silence, reading. The only sounds the turning of pages and the soft breathing of the two massive dogs sleeping at her feet. When he did speak, he spoke of time. He'd pick up a book on the Roman Empire and point to a passage about the Praetorian Guard. Their discipline was overestimated, he would say, a distant look in his eyes. Their loyalty was always for sale. He spoke as if recalling a frustrating business dealing from the previous week. He showed her his collection. Not the art and sculptures in the public wings of the house, but his private treasures. A samurai sword, its edge still impossibly sharp, that he said was a gift from a warrior who lost a wager in the 17th century. A star chart, drawn on vellum, mapping constellations that were no longer visible in the night sky. Each object was a memory, a piece of a life so long it defied imagination. And with every story, every shared silence, Linnea saw more of the man behind the monster. She saw the weariness of immortality, the crushing weight of memory. She saw the profound loneliness of a being who had watched everyone he had ever known turn to dust. He, in turn, seemed to thaw in her presence. A subtle shift, but she noticed it. The oppressive cold that surrounded him lessened when she was near. The restless shadows in the house grew calm. He began to ask her questions, not just about the dogs, but about her. About her childhood, her dreams, the quiet life she'd lived before him. He listened with an unnerving intensity, as if her simple, mundane stories were the most fascinating tales he had ever heard. He was memorizing her. One evening, she was tending to a scratch on Erebus's leg. The dog had scraped it on a loose piece of fencing, and while it was minor, Linnea was carefully cleaning it. Alistair came into the kennels, watching her gentle, efficient movements. "You have a healer's touch," he observed, his voice soft. "I just don't want it to get infected," she said, concentrating on her task. As she applied a salve, her hand slipped, and a sharp edge on the dog's collar buckle sliced a thin, deep cut across her palm. It wasn't serious, but it welled up with blood immediately, a bright crimson line against her skin. "Ah," she hissed, more in annoyance than pain. In the space of a heartbeat, he was beside her. He moved so fast he seemed to teleport, a blur of motion that her eyes couldn't follow. One moment he was across the room, the next he was kneeling in front of her, his cold hand gently taking hers. His focus on the line of blood on her palm was terrifying in its intensity. His pupils dilated, the black swallowing the dark iris until only a thin ring remained. A low, predatory sound, something between a hiss and a growl, vibrated in his chest. The air crackled. The lights in the kennel flickered violently. Nyx and Erebus, sensing the shift in him, rose to their feet, a warning rumble starting in their chests, directed not at an outside threat, but at their master. "Alistair," Linnea said, her voice calm and steady, though her heart was hammering. Her voice cut through the haze of his rising instinct. His eyes cleared, the black receding. The growl died in his throat. He looked from the blood to her face, and an expression of profound self-loathing crossed his features. "Forgive me," he breathed, his voice ragged. He released her hand as if it had burned him. But Linnea didn't pull away. Instead, she reached out with her other hand and placed it on his cheek. The skin was impossibly cold, like fine silk laid over ice. "There is nothing to forgive," she said softly. "You can't help what you are." He closed his eyes at her touch, leaning into her warmth for a fraction of a second. It was a moment of pure, unguarded vulnerability. He, the ancient predator, the vampire king who commanded shadows, was brought to his knees not by a weapon or a rival, but by a drop of blood and a surge of compassion. He stood abruptly, pulling back into his shell of cold control. He turned and walked to a medical kit on the wall, his movements stiff. He brought back a bandage and, with meticulous, gentle care that seemed at odds with his nature, he cleaned and dressed the cut on her hand. His fingers were long and graceful, the touch feather-light, but the cold of them seeped into her skin, a strange, intimate chill. When he was done, he held her hand for a moment longer than necessary. "Your compassion will be the death of you, Linnea," he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her knuckles. "Or," she replied, looking him directly in the eye, "it could be the thing that saves you." He let go of her hand and stepped back, the distance returning between them. But it was an illusion. Something had been forged in that moment, a bond deeper than master and employee, deeper even than friendship. It was a fragile, terrifying, and beautiful thing. The threat, when it came, was not a storm of violence, but a whisper in the dark. It began with small things: a dead raven on the doorstep, its neck broken, but with no sign of injury. The dogs barking frantically at shadows that seemed to have too much substance. A faint, cloying scent of withered flowers that would drift through the house and then vanish. Alistair grew more tense, more watchful. The stillness he normally wore was now coiled, like a panther about to spring. He spent long hours in his study, poring over ancient maps and texts. "It is Cassandra," he told Linnea one night, his voice grim. "A rival I thought long vanquished. She was always one for theatrics. She is testing my defenses, circling." He forbade Linnea from leaving the house after dusk. He doubled the human security patrols, though he admitted they would be useless against the true threat. His true security system was a girl and her 2 dogs. The attack came on a moonless night. Linnea was woken from a restless sleep by the dogs. They were not barking. They were standing at the foot of her bed, utterly silent, every muscle in their bodies rigid, their lips pulled back in silent snarls. The hair along their spines was raised. They were staring at the large window that overlooked the gardens. Linnea slipped out of bed. A thick, unnatural fog had rolled in, blanketing the grounds. It swirled and eddied in ways that defied the windless night. And in the fog, she saw them. Figures. Tall, gaunt, indistinct shapes that moved with a jerky, unnatural gait. They were made of shadow and malice, things that belonged in a fever dream. They weren't trying to get into the house. They were simply emerging, coalescing from the fog at the edge of the manicured lawns, their numbers growing. A silent, encroaching army of nightmares. Suddenly, Alistair was in her room. He wore no suit, just black trousers and a dark shirt. He was a creature of the night, ready for battle. His eyes glowed with that soft crimson light, fully unleashed. "They are thralls," he said, his voice a low, dangerous command. "Empty vessels she has filled with her will. They are meant to draw me out." Then don't go, Linnea pleaded, her hand gripping his arm. The muscle beneath was hard as stone. I must, he said. They will eventually overwhelm the wards on the house itself. This is my battle. No, she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. It's ours. She turned to the dogs. Nyx and Erebus were looking at her, their intelligent eyes waiting for a command. Their instincts screamed at them to attack, but their loyalty to her held them in check. She was their alpha. They will listen to me, she told Alistair. Let us fight together. He looked at her, at the fierce determination in her face, at the two monster dogs standing as her loyal soldiers. For centuries, he had fought alone. The idea of an ally, a partner, was so foreign it was almost painful. But he saw the truth in her words. Her control over the dogs was a weapon he did not possess. Stay by the main doors, he commanded. Do not enter the grounds. Engage only what comes onto the terrace. Do you understand? She nodded. He leaned in, his lips brushing her forehead. The touch was colder than ice, a shocking, intimate brand. Stay alive, Linnea, he whispered. Then he was gone, a black streak flowing out of the room and down the stairs. Linnea and the dogs followed. They took up a position on the wide stone terrace that overlooked the lawn. Below, the battle began. Alistair was not a man anymore. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of impossible speed and devastating strength. He moved through the shadowy thralls like a reaper through wheat. They were torn apart, dissipated into black smoke before they could even touch him. But for every one he destroyed, two more seemed to rise from the fog. It was a tide of darkness, and he was a solitary island against it. A few of the creatures broke from the main group, scuttling toward the house with spider-like speed. They swarmed up the terrace steps. Nyx, Erebus, Linnea said, her voice low and clear. Watch. The command was all they needed. They met the thralls on the steps. It was a clash of primal forces. The dogs were a flurry of teeth and claws, tearing into the smoky forms. The thralls had no substance to wound, but the dogs' pure, vital rage seemed to unravel them, shredding them back into the nothingness from which they were formed. Linnea stood her ground, her voice a constant anchor for them. Here, Nyx! Erebus, left flank! Good! Hold the line! She was a general commanding her elite troops, her fear burned away by adrenaline and a fierce, protective love for the strange, dark world she now called home. One of the creatures, faster than the others, slipped past the dogs. It lunged for her, its featureless face a vortex of shadow, its claws like razors of solidified night. Linnea stumbled back, crying out, but before the claws could find her, a black shape intercepted it. Alistair. He had seen the danger and crossed the entire lawn in a single impossible bound. He caught the thrall by its throat, and with a sound of cracking stone, crushed it into oblivion. He stood over her for a second, his chest heaving, his crimson eyes blazing. I told you to be careful, he snarled, his voice thick with primordial fury. I am, she shot back, getting to her feet. Now get back to the fight before we are overrun. A flicker of stark admiration crossed his face. He gave her a sharp nod, a king acknowledging his queen, and then plunged back into the fray. Together, they held the line. He was the sword. She was the shield. He was the storm. She was the anchor. They fought until the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky. As the weak gray light filtered through the fog, the remaining thralls dissolved, unable to withstand the coming of the sun. Silence fell. The lawn was littered with dark, fading stains on the grass. The fog receded. The battle was over. Linnea was exhausted, her body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. The dogs were panting at her sides, weary but unharmed. Alistair stood in the center of the lawn, his clothes torn, but his body unmarked. He looked at her, across the field of their joint victory, and in his eyes was a look of awe and reverence she had never seen before. The war, however, was not won. Cassandra herself was still out there. But something had changed that night. Alistair Thorne was no longer fighting alone. The next day, Alistair made a series of calls. His voice was cold, clipped, and held the weight of absolute power. He was moving pieces on a chessboard that spanned the globe. 2 days later, a black car swept up the drive. It did not contain a threat. It contained Marcus, her old boss, and the former owner of the kennel, a man named Mr. Jennings. They were brought into Alistair's study, their faces pale with terror. Linnea was there, standing by the fireplace, Nyx and Erebus at her feet, like two furry statues. Alistair was behind his immense desk, a figure of judicial authority. "Mr. Jennings," Alistair began, his voice dangerously soft. "I have recently acquired a controlling interest in your company. Effective immediately, it is a subsidiary of Thorne Industries." The man looked like he was going to faint. "Your methods," Alistair continued, his gaze flicking to Marcus, "are antiquated. Your results, as I have witnessed firsthand, are a failure. Your judgment of talent is, to be generous, pathetic." He let the words hang in the silent room. "You dismissed the most gifted animal empath I have ever encountered because you were too arrogant to see past your own brutal incompetence." He stood up, walking around the desk to stand beside Linnea. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a clear gesture of ownership and protection. "Miss Linnea is the new director of the Thorne Industries Animal Division. Her methods will now be your company's official training doctrine. Her salary will be deducted from your former profits. You will report to her. And if you ever show her an ounce of disrespect—" He leaned in, and his voice dropped to a predatory whisper, "I will dismantle your lives so completely, you will not have enough left to beg from." He straightened up. "You are dismissed." The two men practically ran from the room. Linnea looked at Alistair, her heart full. It wasn't about the title, or the money, or the revenge. It was that he had taken her deepest professional wound, the source of her shame, and transformed it into a crown. He had forced the world that had dismissed her to kneel. He had made them see her. This was the act of a true vampire king, not just a creature of the night, but a ruler of men. "That wasn't necessary," she said softly. "It was," he countered, his dark eyes intense. "It was a correction. The world is full of fools who cannot recognize value. I am simply re-educating them." He took her hand, the one he had bandaged. The small scar was a faint white line on her palm. He raised it to his lips, his mouth impossibly cold against her skin. "This is your home now, Linnea, if you will have it. Not as my employee, as my partner, my chatelaine, the mistress of Blackwood, the queen to its king." She looked around the dark, magnificent room, at the loyal beasts at her feet, and at the ancient, powerful man who saw her more clearly than anyone ever had. This strange, shadowy world was the only place she had ever truly belonged. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." A year passed. The seasons turned, painting the forest around Blackwood in hues of gold and crimson before burying it in the pristine white of winter. Cassandra was dealt with. Alistair never shared the details, but one day the oppressive sense of being watched was simply gone. The house settled into a deep, peaceful quiet. Linnea had made the cold, sterile mansion a home. There were flowers in vases now, books left open on tables, soft throws draped over the severe furniture. Her warmth had seeped into the very walls. Even the shadows seemed softer, more content in her presence. Nyx and Erebus were her constant companions, great, gentle beasts, who were as likely to be found sleeping with their heads in her lap as they were patrolling the grounds. Her animal division was a resounding success, her methods of empathy and understanding revolutionizing the field. She was happy, truly, deeply happy. One evening, she was curled up by the massive fireplace in the library, reading, a glass of red wine on the table beside her. Alistair entered the room not with his usual spectral silence, but with the soft tread of a man at ease in his own home. He sat in the chair opposite her, watching the firelight play across her face. "A year ago today," he said, his voice a low, intimate rumble, "you knelt in my courtyard and calmed my monsters." She smiled. "And now I live with all three of them." He returned the smile. It was a rare, beautiful thing that transformed his severe features. "That you do." The comfortable silence stretched between them, filled with all the things they no longer needed to say. Then he grew serious. "I watch you, Linnea. I see the light in your eyes. I cherish the warmth of your skin. But I am a creature of ages, and you are a beautiful, fleeting flame. Every beat of your heart is one I will not get back when it stops." The conversation she had known was coming, the one she had pushed to the back of her mind, was finally here. Her mortality. "Your life is a precious, brilliant thing," he continued, his voice laced with a profound, ancient sorrow. "But it does not have to be a short one." He wasn't commanding. He wasn't demanding. He was offering. The greatest, most terrible gift he could give. Eternity. An endless expanse of nights by his side. "It is a choice, he said, "and it must be yours and yours alone. I will love you for the length of your days, however many they may be. But if you wished for more, if you wished for all of my days, you need only ask." She put her book down and looked at him. She saw the endless weight of his years, the loneliness he had carried, and the love in his crimson-tinged eyes. A love so vast and deep it could swallow oceans of time. She thought of the life she'd had before, the gray, invisible existence, and she thought of this life, filled with shadows and monsters, with loyalty and with a love that had seen her, truly seen her, from the very first moment. She reached across the space between them and laid her hand on his. She felt the familiar, thrilling cold of his skin, a cold that no longer felt like winter, but like the deep, refreshing quiet, the midnight sky. She didn't need to speak the word. He saw the answer in her eyes, and for the second time in 500 years, the Vampire King felt his frozen heart beat, not with surprise this time, but with the promise of a shared forever. For more stories where quiet compassion conquers ancient loneliness, and where being overlooked becomes the source of ultimate strength, subscribe to Herb Files. So tell me, would you have stayed? Comment where you are listening from tonight. I stay up until my eyes burn to bring you these stories. If this one touched you, do not break my heart. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one.